And all of a sudden today, the Minister of Justice has a different tune. And when an issue came forward where there were questions and leadership required, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, when those issues, and there were tough issues and there were tough questions being asked, but I went in front of the cameras and the microphones. I didn't ask a communications staff member to do it. And that is very clearly on the record. But we have a minister, when any amount of controversy comes up, put the communication. Get a spin doctor out there. Give me some cover so we can see the true amount or the impact of some of these issues, and maybe I can try and spin this another way. That's not leadership, and that's not what the Chambers of Commerce, that's not what the community leadership across this province was expecting of the Dexter NDP, but what they're getting is a government now, in dealing with corrections, that will not provide the disclosure that they would have argued and demanded be provided, are not aware of what it is that was committed and processes with regards to vests, for the minister not to have a clue of what's going on and the procurement process affecting hundreds of thousands of dollars. He can try and spin it whatever which way he wants in question period. It is not what Nova Scotians are noticing, because what we're noticing is obviously a disjunct between what ministers are doing and what their Minister of Finance is saying. But I guess maybe he needs to give them a few $100,000 to get some more consultants to spin a news story for them. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say, when just speaking of corrections as well, and this government that has quite frankly thrown communities under the bus, the attack on rural Nova Scotia, look no further than Pictou County and the Hector. You know, there's another boat they're about to sink. They sunk the Cat. They're willing to sink the Hector. You know, I'm glad that the Marine Atlantic ferries are federal jurisdiction, because they'd want to sink those too. And you know, what they are doing is sinking the economy and putting Nova Scotians in an unfair, unjust position as a result of what the NDP manifesto set out to do about their commitment that these socialists that the NDP would do to throw Nova Scotians under the bus. And I think if other people have been thrown under the bus, aside from Southwest Nova, aside from the workers that do the Hector interpretive, I've also seen as well that they've thrown the corrections officers and their families in Cumberland County under the Dexter NDP bus. They've thrown those families, and they're prepared to throw them to the curb and take hard-working, long-term employees of the province and take them away from their families in the region, when in fact there was a case being that was put together with communities supporting that case for economic and social stability within our province, to recognize that there should be regional and rural fairness to to counter some of the issues that need to be addressed in rural and remote areas of the province. We've seen as well, when you look at the treatment of the Spring Hill municipality by this government when it came to corrections. And what we've seen is very clearly, and this is probably most disturbing probably for members of the NDP, when their government will throw them under the bus when it comes to the issues. Just ask the member from Cumberland North how his government stood by him, or in fact didn't stand by him. And I guess the Dexter bus was going, probably heading out of the province to do some shopping in Moncton, and didn't really care, and didn't even look to see he was on the side of the road before I ran him over with the Dexter bus. But there's probably thousands. The member from Halifax, Sable Settle Island, I'm only glad there's water between here and Sable Island, or half the horses will be run over and the seals will be taken out in the process coming up the beach. But we don't need them. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the horses are safe because there isn't a ferry that gets them there that this government hasn't sunk in the process.
Order, please. The honourable member for Cape Breton North has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased you can try and get the members of the government. They're obviously getting exercised about what reality is coming to bear on their unfair treatment, and what being part of the Dexter NDP is really materializing to be. And what we also know here in the province of Nova Scotia, as we heard here in the House yesterday with regional development, when you're trying to talk in a constructive way about how the Dexter NDP could work with communities on health and wellness infrastructure that supports jobs and working families in the province of Nova Scotia, and yet they're thrown under the bus. Heard the Minister of Health Promotion Protection want to blame the previous government. So, well, it was a $68 million program. There was only $5 million in it when I came in. I only have $5 million. But you know, the Minister of Natural Resources, who had a modified budget, obviously is more equal at the cabinet table if he could spend $100 million to buy dirt than invest in people. But obviously one minister has greater weight when it comes to issues. But I don't know of how much of that dirt that the minister is now presiding over is going to create jobs, is going to produce better health and wellness outcomes. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, go to the communities. So when all else failed and the argument wasn't there, the Minister of Health Promotion Protection wanted to say, well, I'll show you the map of Nova Scotia to show you the political motivation of the investments that had been made. And meanwhile, I'm talking about 14 other projects, $20 million. And I'd support every one of them. And coincidentally, so could have the government if they actually were thinking and providing leadership and providing a real balance for Nova Scotians, but they won't. And that's what we've seen. So we're not going to go. And I told the minister, you bring out that political map. I know the political map. I know the investments that were made in urban Cape Breton. Was one of them made in my constituency? Yes, it was. Were two of them made in Cape Breton South, a Liberal constituency? Yes, they were. Was one of them made in Cape Breton Nova, an NDP constituency? Yes, they were. So bring out the map. Because what I know is the projects that were worthy and merited the investment were provided them. And throughout this province, where they want to go and try now point to a past government and the decisions to invest, I welcome that. I welcome it. I only regret, probably for members of the government that probably were bemoaning any political motivation around it, that the minister was unable to get additional dollars to support their projects in their community. Because what I know is not only was the government not prepared to invest in those projects with their provincial dollars, they were willing to see federal dollars, they were willing to see municipal dollars, they were willing to see corporate dollars, they were willing to see dollars that were donated from citizens in this province not be tapped and projects not to be realized. I did not hear yet of the Minister of Natural Resources when he went on his spending spree of glee, buying up as much bog as he could. And it was probably the fog over the bog and the thinking of the government, Mr. Speaker, when they undertook that process. Because I know if I had a choice and I was dealing with balance, the minister could have said, well, let's get some land and let's make sure we invest in people as our #1 priority, and people during what they talk about as an unprecedented recession, the largest one since the Great Depression. And Mr. Speaker, if the government were sincere, they'd be funding those projects in rural and urban Nova Scotia, making sure that key infrastructure is being renewed or built and jobs are being created as a result of that, but the government chooses not to. And the member from Sackville-Cobequid, I'm hoping at some point will get up on his pins in this House and actually say something about what he's doing to advocate for his constituency. But Mr. Speaker, I'll get up as often as I can and willfully get up and to advocate for now, because we have a government that doesn't speak for most of Nova Scotia. That's why Progressive Conservatives will. That's why we were proud with the investments we made. And that's why we'll continue to hold this government to account for their ill-headed and ill-founded decisions they've been making. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today, Mr. Speaker, to offer some observations on behalf of the people of Kings North, the electors who have given me the privilege and I would say the responsibility to serve in this House. We are gathered in a place that matters. Our work, the work that's been done in the past, and the work that now engages us, influences the lives of each and every Nova Scotian, young and old, from Inverness to Sandy Point, from Scotts Bay to Canso. The people of Nova Scotia have entrusted us with their future. It is a privilege, Mr. Speaker, to be associated with the members of the House of Assembly. What we bring to this place as individuals, along with our ability to work cooperatively, will determine the quality and extent of our success. I stand too, Mr. Speaker, in full recognition that my presence here is in itself a consequence of being part of a community. The work that I do is only possible because of the love, advice, and support offered so freely by my wife, Donna McGrath. The encouragement, efforts, and investments of my extended family and the members of my Kings North Riding Executive are critical elements both of my personal and political life. And I am grateful to the leaders of the municipality of Kings, the town of Kentville, the village commissions and community associations who have welcomed me into their midst and thus into their efforts and the lives of my neighbors. Since my election in last June, I have established a community office in Kentville. While that project involved identifying a location, the purchase of furniture and equipment, arranging advertising, and incidentally using our public space to display the artistic work of the Evangeline Artists Co-op, the most important part of an office is the constituency assistant. Ann Harris has taken on that role with skill, maturity, and enthusiasm, harnessing her experience, communication skills, problem-solving ability, assertiveness, and sense of humor in the service of the people of Kings North. Together, we have been building a responsive service for constituents. During these past months, hundreds of people have experienced the benefit of her work. I'm one of those people, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to Ann for the partnership that she and I are creating. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge the critical role that you hold in the work of this House. Our debates shape and reshape the fabric of provincial life. As a consequence, passions frequently run high when in fact clarity and reason are the better ingredients of effective thinking and good outcomes. Your effort as Speaker to maintain order and a climate of respectful behavior are at the heart of the democratic process. Your task isn't easy, but you have my support for making the House of Assembly a place characterized less by passion and attack and more by reason and respect. On March 25th, 2010, Her Honour Mayanne Francis, the Lieutenant Governor, delivered the speech from the throne with a dignity and sense of ceremony that honours all Nova Scotians. The Lieutenant Governor's presence here at the opening of the second session of the 61st General Assembly is a reminder of the long, hard-won victory of parliamentary democracy. She attends the House at the invitation of the Assembly and leaves us to govern when the task is complete. When Her Honour shook hands with the Premier and with the leaders of the opposition parties as she made her way out of the House on that day, I thought about Joseph Howe and the reforms of more than a century and a half ago. Ours is a government elected by the people and responsible to this Assembly. We are a people governed by ourselves. That is why this place matters so much, Mr. Speaker. In their hearts, Nova Scotians know, and through her presence, Her Honour, the Lieutenant Governor, is a symbol of who we are and what we have created as a people. We can be proud and grateful for her leadership. But, Mr. Speaker, leadership is a quality in play throughout our province, and certainly within the confluence of communities referred to as Kings North. Each of these communities, the County of Kings, the town of Kentville, the villages of Canning and Port Williams, and the many hamlets and communities are served and watched over by local governments. The dozens of women and men who seek office invest large parts of their lives, as do those of us in this House, to make their communities better, to make life better for families, and to build a better future. These leaders are faced with complex challenges, whether it's finding a way to create a new community park in Baxter's Harbour, searching for traffic solutions in New Minas, or sorting out water safety, population growth, and the protection of agricultural land in Port Williams. The leaders are engaged in rich opportunities, underscored by multiple opinions that require input from several governments. This multiplicity of governance in a relatively small geographic territory poses challenges. It is clear to me that we can only achieve our dreams and hopes if communities can find ways to work together. While there are challenges to working together, the fruits of success are significant. I think of King's Transit, a service that now runs the length of the Annapolis Valley. While everyone continues to seek better service, we have probably what is the best public transportation system in Nova Scotia outside HRM. King's Transit is a product of partnerships between many governments and speaks to the value of working together. More recently, the County of Kings, the town of Kentville, and Destination Southwest Nova Scotia pooled resources to establish a year-round visitor information centre in Kentville, something no one party to the agreement could have accomplished on its own. To get the hard work done, Mr. Speaker, we need to reach far beyond what we've already been. As Pierre Ducasse has been fond of repeating, to attain the results you've never had, you have to do what you've never done. I know that we have the capacity to succeed in Kings North. Recently, I pulled together a group of executive directors and leaders who represent a range of not-for-profit organizations that serve the citizens of Kings County. I asked them to share their perceptions of the problems and opportunities we face. They did that, but these folks impressed me even more with their commitment to the long term, their dedication to making life better for their constituents, and with their ability to transmute meager resources into significant outcomes. These not-for-profit organizations, local governments, commissions and associations, and let's not forget volunteer groups, families that care for their members, friends who look out for each other, are signs that in Kings North we have what it takes to succeed when times are difficult. And Mr. Speaker, this is a difficult time. Last summer, our government assumed an unsustainable fiscal inheritance. On April 6th, our government showed that we have what it takes to transform that inheritance. The budget introduced by the Minister of Finance lays out a multi-year fiscal strategy to manage the province's finances, to get Nova Scotia back to balance, and to live within our means. We have understood that only tough decisions will restore the province to a solid financial standing. Effective July 1st, the harmonized sales tax will be restored to 15%, providing additional revenue of $215 million this year. We also created a fifth tax bracket for individuals with annual incomes of more than $150,000 that will generate $31 million in revenue. And we will use new care with every public dollar. Of the $1.4 billion fiscal gap identified by the expert advisory panel last summer, we will eliminate $1.1 billion through expenditure management and restraint. Our government is prepared to take on the hard work because we are committed to making life better. Mr. Speaker, our government knows that while getting back to balance is critical, it's equally important to be fair. The budget achieves that. It offers the right balance of priorities, values, programs, and services. Our government is committed to better health care for all Nova Scotians, for example. Our government understands that getting back to balance shouldn't stand in the way of investing in the economy to create good jobs and new opportunities for Nova Scotians. We need to make sure, for example, that rural Nova Scotians have access to broadband internet services, a matter of particular importance to those who live on and under the North Mountain of Kings County. It's critical that we continue to grow a green economy, maximizing the potential of wind and tidal energy. We need to further explore and build our relationships around the globe to identify and capitalize on opportunities for economic growth and better jobs here at home. And in Kings North, the agricultural community is looking forward to our government's 10-year strategy, a plan that will help farmers develop new opportunities, manage risk, and become more environmentally sustainable. Mr. Speaker, this government recognizes that moving forward requires a multidimensional plan. While economist Milton Friedman's views might be appealing to some, for our government, it just doesn't follow that doing less will result in more. So I am pleased that our government is taking action to make life more affordable. Too many of our citizens live in poverty, and our government commits that it will not leave people behind. We'll move forward with a transformation of the employment support and income assistance program to increase economic independence and enhance social inclusion. We recognize that it's time to move away from ESIA as a service of last resort, and time to build a program that starts with the value of exploring what clients and families need. We'll also use the affordable living tax credit worth $70 million to lessen the impact to the HST for Nova Scotian households with low and modest incomes. A poverty reduction credit will turn another $3 million annually to about 150,000 individuals who live with very low incomes. We'll remove the provincial portion of the HST on children's clothing, footwear, feminine hygiene products, and diapers, returning about $11 million to families everywhere in Nova Scotia. Seniors who receive the Guaranteed Income Supplement will no longer have to pay provincial income tax. What that means, Mr. Speaker, is that $12.5 million will be given back to an estimated 18,000 seniors across the province. These are examples of making life more affordable, of making life better for families. Mr. Speaker, I support the objectives of getting back to balance and of living within our means because I recognize that our economic prosperity and the financial health of our province are at the foundation of our capacity to create and provide services that people need. Nothing must distract us from our vision of a better world, not just for the privileged few, but for everyone in Nova Scotia. Our goal must be to eliminate poverty, to ensure that citizens have access to quality education, responsive health care, and good roads. The path back to financial balance and the commitment to living in a way we can afford is a means to a better end. I emphasize this point, Mr. Speaker, because for too long we have allowed those who are poor to be invisible, hoping, I suppose, that being out of sight, these folks will be out of mind. Recently, I saw Nance Ackerman's film 4 Feet Up. It's a fine documentary describing the life of a Kings County family that lives in poverty. Several people told me that the effect of seeing the film was to keep them awake at night. It compelled others to write letters to the editor and to politicians like me, demanding action so that children and families don't have to live this way. I saw the film as a valid description of the lives of too many families who are our neighbors. We need to make sure that the elimination of poverty remains a priority. We must indeed ensure that no Nova Scotian is left behind. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are a strong and resilient people. We are at a crossroads that can create and lead us to a better place, to a stronger, more progressive province, prosperous province, one that embraces all of us and includes each and every citizen in all of the good things that life has to offer. I try to keep J.S. Wordsworth's message close at hand each day, and I reach for it again now. What we desire for ourselves, we wish for all. To this end, may we take up our share of the world's work and the world's struggles. And let us keep up the faith and the fight that will lead us to the ends we seek. Almost 50 years ago, Tommy Douglas mesmerized a massive crowd in Ottawa with a speech, still relevant today, that ended with the words of poet and visionary William Blake, words that still matter at this new crossroads that we have created for ourselves. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand till we have built Jerusalem in this green and pleasant land. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Motion carried.
to order. I will now recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to call the committee's attention to resolutions E16, E20, and E25.
Thank you. I will now call on the Premier for opening remarks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here today in estimates. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I've been in the House of Assembly now for a dozen years. I don't think I can ever recall the Premier's office being called in estimate. So this is, I said I can't recall. So my friends opposite are saying that it was called during Russell McClellan's time here, but I think at that point it was in the Red Room as opposed to in the main chamber. Just before I begin, with me today is Greg Keefe, who is my deputy in the Premier's office, and Judith Sullivan-Corney, who is my deputy responsible for Aboriginal affairs and for intergovernmental affairs, which, Mr. Speaker, are two of the additional portfolios that I carry with me as the Premier of the province. You would also be aware, Mr. Chairman, that in addition, I also have responsibility for military relations, and in that regard, Mr. Speaker, it's a great pleasure to have the privilege to serve in all three of those portfolios, being, as they are, important ones for the specific interests that are noted in the department, but also for the people of the province. I would just, for a second, like to comment on the Premier's office and its operations. Mr. Speaker, we have an extraordinarily busy office. Of course, it looks after the day-to-day operations of government in many respects. I can tell you that one of the things I learned since being in the office is just the tremendous level of dedication that comes from the public service and support of the Premier's office. Daily, I'm the beneficiary of an extraordinary amount of work that comes out of the departments in the way of background information, in the way of the kind of diligent execution of their various portfolios, the support that I get for the various aspects of the Premier's office, which can change virtually daily. As you can understand, as I said, one of the things that we deal with in the Premier's office is intergovernmental affairs. So that in and of itself has a broad range of topics that we can be involved with. On one day, Mr. Chairman, we're dealing with the other Atlantic provinces, maybe either individually or through the Council of Atlantic Premiers. Then, Mr. Speaker, we're dealing with the New England states, oftentimes through the New England governors, but sometimes through the Council of State Governments, which is an organization that I've proudly been a part of over many years. Mr. Speaker, I can say that just recently, although I went to the last one, the SUS conference, which involves the southeastern United States and eastern Canadian provinces, just took place in Mississippi. The Minister of Economic and Rural Development was there on my behalf because the matters here in the House, of course, made it impossible for me to be able to attend. But this is a very important organization. It's a relatively new one on the intergovernmental affairs side, mainly because of the amount of work, the amount of trade that we undertake with southeastern United States. Of course, on broader trade issues, we're involved just recently on on issues in Washington. Mr. Chairman, we were able there to have the opportunity to meet with many of the governors in the United States, but not limited to that. In fact, we met with the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Lisa Jackson. We met with Mr. Wellinghoff, who looks after FERC in the United States. We met with Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture. We were able to pursue the business interests of the province of Nova Scotia, having the opportunity to meet with officials at Lockheed Martin, but also with a number of other businesses who are looking to do either new work in Nova Scotia or additional work. So you can see that in each one of these cases, whether it's intergovernmental affairs or Aboriginal affairs, which is, to me, a completely fascinating aspect of the work we do, trying to build a consensus with Aboriginal peoples and to try and advance many of the interests that they have in respect to bettering the lives of Aboriginal people in the province. And this is actually an exciting new opportunity because many of the Aboriginal bands here in the province are doing exciting new things in economic development, which I think are ultimately not just going to benefit the on-reserve people, but also more generally the people of the province. And as I mentioned, I've also have the privilege to serve with military relations. And all these departments I hope to get a chance to talk about more fully as the individual estimates are called. But of course, the matters with respect to military relations is of particular interest to me, simply because I had the great privilege to serve in our armed forces. Spent some time, Mr. Speaker or Mr. Chairman, on the West Coast, serving in a couple of capacities through the training squadron there at Esquimalt, but also as the Command Information Officer for Maritime Forces Pacific. And I think what's interesting, of course, and I realize that this is just a function of age, but many of the people that I went through the Naval Officer Training Center with are now in offices of authority in the Canadian Navy. A good friend of mine was the commander of the Toronto. He's now a Commodore, still working, I believe, in Ottawa. But one of the fascinating things for me was during the trooping of the color, I realized that the parade commander that day was a person that I went through basic training with in Chilliwack. So it is a function of age, but it is also a handy thing when you're serving in a particular office to actually know many of the people who are in the command structure. And I must say the cooperation that I have received from all elements of the armed forces and the welcome that I receive whenever I go to any of the armed forces events is always outstanding. And we have every reason to be proud of the tremendous work that continues to be done by our armed forces personnel. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll go back now just to talk a little bit about some of the things that we found when we came into government. Mr. Speaker, I've said many, many times that government was on an unsustainable path and that we cannot simply sit back and do nothing. Expenses were rising faster than revenues. Our debt is too high, driven by a lack of financial or physical discipline. The interest on the debt, Mr. Chairman, will soon be more than $1 billion a year. So the reality is that as a new government, we have a responsibility to simply clean up the mess that we found. And I believe that we have undertaken the difficult and hard work of getting our finances back to balance. It will ultimately mean not just this year, Mr. Chairman, but over the coming years, many difficult decisions. The Minister of Finance set forth in his budget on April 6th, and of course this is what we are discussing here in this committee, but it outlines a 4-year plan to move the province back to financial health. People and the opposition has been critical of not coming back to balance this year, Mr. Speaker. And as I said before, it was not a question. It's not a question of being able to do it. You could have gone back to balance this year. What it would have meant, though, Mr. Chairman, is it would have been very deep cuts in the civil service, in the services that are made to the people of the province, and for that reason, we decided that we would actually take the advice of the economic panel, take the advice of Deloitte when they said that the better choice was to do this in a way that was going to be sustainable over the long term. And that's, it's a 4-year plan back to balance, but it's not meant, of course, to end in 4 years or to be only 4 years. It means it returns us to financial, physical discipline so that the province can move forward in a way that is responsible, that recognizes the limitations that we have, that recognizes that we have to supply a certain level of services to the people of the province. This budget, Mr. Chairman, makes balanced choices to increase revenue, to pare down expenses, and to grow the economy. This budget, our first, came after extensive consultations. We impaneled a group of economic experts who delivered, Mr. Chairman, a very valuable report. The Minister of Finance, and I think he is to be congratulated for his willingness, Mr. Chairman, to travel the length and breadth of this province seeking the wisdom of the people of Nova Scotia. This was an unparalleled consultation process, Mr. Chairman, that took us to many communities which are not usually consulted in this process. In addition to the back to balance sessions, the finance minister also, the finance minister received many written submissions, which he made the commitment to write every time, to read every line of. Mr. Chairman, he met with many individual groups in addition to the ones who came out to the back to the balance sessions. There could be no debate or any doubt about the kind of undertaking that the Minister of Finance took under the back to the balance process. It was thorough. It was exhaustive. It reached out in a way that no government before has to the people of Nova Scotia and said, we want to hear your collective wisdom because we intend to follow it. And Mr. Chairman, that's what we did. We are taking the first steps on the road back to balance. We've outlined a plan that is smart, strategic, and steady. I don't mean to suggest that little has been done so far, but we're waiting for this budget. In fact, just the opposite has happened. Government, as promised, began an expenditure management initiative last year that will see savings of up to 1% across government for non-essential spending. We plan to look at every expenditure in government and ensure it is needed and being delivered appropriately. As outlined in the budget, we plan to save the taxpayers of Nova Scotia $772 million over the next 4 years through careful expenditure management. Last month, we told government departments to end March Madness, the practice of quickly spending unspent funds just before the end of the budget year. Instead, those unspent funds will go toward paying down the debt. These are the right decisions for Nova Scotians. These are the types of decisions that Nova Scotians can expect from this government. We will continue to take this approach. For example, more than 60% of our expenditures are given to third parties. We will work closely, as I mentioned in question period today, Mr. Chairman, we will work closely with our school boards, our district health authorities, and municipalities to find savings where it makes sense through streamlined administration, through shared services, and through technology. Salaries, Mr. Chairman, also form a large part of the provincial budget, and in order to take a balanced approach to getting back to balance, we'll reduce the size of the civil service by as much as 10% over the next 4 years. But we're not going to do that by cutting and chopping jobs. Instead, Mr. Chairman, this will be a prudent and careful reduction that will rely on attrition and voluntary departures, not layoffs. Right now, reducing spending does not go far enough to return Nova Scotia to balance, Mr. Chairman. The budget restores the HST to its historic level of 15%. This was not an easy choice, but it was a solution that we heard over and over again at the Back to Balance consultations. Nova Scotians said they didn't want an increase in the HST to negatively affect lower income families, Mr. Chairman, so we have instituted the affordable living tax credit and the poverty reduction credit. And something that I'm particularly proud of our government for doing, Mr. Chairman, is that no longer will seniors who receive the guaranteed income supplement have to pay income tax on it. Mr. Chairman, this was something that remained in place over the course of the last government. People would often come to me, particularly at tax time, and they would say, well, if the federal government recognizes that this is the money that we need in order to be able to live on, if this is the guaranteed income supplement, why do we continue to pay tax on it? Well, Mr. Chairman, that will no longer be the case. The provincial portion of the HST will no longer apply to children's clothing, to children's shoes, to diapers, and to feminine hygiene products. Last year, Mr. Chairman, we cut the provincial portion of the HST from home energy costs. Tax relief will continue, putting $84 million back into the pockets of taxpayers. For the first time in 10 years, Mr. Chairman, we will increase funding to transition houses and to women's centres. This is just some of the ways that we are helping to make life better and more affordable for families in this province. Getting back to balance goes hand in hand with the ability to deliver the critical programs and services that Nova Scotians need and want. This government will provide better health care, will make life more affordable, will create jobs, and will grow the economy. As to the latter 2 points, last year, the government created good jobs by investing some $724 million in capital funding in roads, schools, hospitals, and housing. Many of these investments brought additional funding from the federal and municipal governments. The budget proposed for capital investments this year is some $710 million. This is the biggest two-year capital investment in the province's history. We know the program is having a positive impact on the economy. Our stimulus investments alone will create some 7,000 person-years of employment. That's why we are continuing to invest in projects around the province. These projects will vary from highways and bridges to energy-saving renovations at our schools, to a children's camp, to rebuilding the Windsor Curling Club. My government continues with year 2 of the housing stimulus plan. We will spend $128 million to build affordable housing units and upgrade existing ones across the province. As the recession ends, our capital stimulus efforts will also. but government efforts to grow the economy and create jobs will not. We've already made significant investments to create hundreds of jobs. Our green economy investment with Daewoo and Pictou County is just one example. In this budget, we have cut the small business tax by 0.5 percentage point. That is the first cut in over 15 years, Mr. Chairman, and we realize that it is an important signal to the small business community that we understand the challenges they are facing in the new economy, and that we intend, when we get back to balance, to do even more. We recognize the importance of small business to the health of Nova Scotia's economy, and this cut will put millions of dollars back into the hands of small businesses. One key small business is the family farm. We are working on a 10-year strategy that will support the success of this vital industry. We are also completing forward-looking strategies for our aquaculture industry and also our forests, minerals, and parklands. Government will soon release a 5-year plan to pave provincial roads across Nova Scotia. Marketing and promoting this province's primary industries will increase in a smart and coordinated way. We will show the world that Nova Scotia should be the first choice for business. People will also learn something we already know. This province is a great place to live, to work, and to raise a family. We want the world to come to our doorstep. Nova Scotia is also the gateway to the world. Halifax offers the closest all-water connection to North America for ships crossing the Atlantic. It connects businesses to North America's vast transportation network with quick, cost-effective access to major markets. Government continues to give close attention to the Atlantic Gateway Initiative. For example, Mr. Chairman, we have been to Vietnam, which is rapidly growing as a hub for container traffic, to talk about synergies. We are identifying other opportunities to make the gateway a reality. Speaking of coming to Nova Scotia, Mr. Chairman, we are looking forward this year to a visit by Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh this summer. I am sure Her Majesty will be pleased by the warm welcome that she will receive from Nova Scotians. It has been some time since the Queen has been able to visit Nova Scotia, and it will, I am sure, generate great pride and great excitement. This is not the only major celebration this year. As you know, and as I mentioned earlier, I spent some time in the Navy, and therefore I am looking forward to the celebrations around the 100th anniversary of the modern Navy. There is no need to expound on the importance of the Navy, both today and in the long history of Nova Scotia. Needless to say, celebrations will be a time for all to pay tribute to our sailors. As promised, I introduced a bill on April 12th that will establish the first Saturday in November as Air, Army, Sea, and Navy League Cadets Day. The cadets are a group of wonderful organizations that instill such values as leadership, citizenship, and community in thousands of Nova Scotia youth each year. And although it was a long time ago, Mr. Chairman, I can remember the time that I spent in cadets. I think the Cadet Corps are particularly important in the rural areas of our province, where for many young people, they represent an opportunity to participate and to learn valuable skills that serve them well in later life. I'll change tack now to our efforts outside the province. Government will continue to approach our intergovernmental opportunities in a strategic way. We will pursue our priorities with the federal government, both one-on-one and collectively through the Council of the Federation. Mr. Chairman, the Council of Federation will be meeting this year in Winnipeg. I'm looking forward again to the cooperative relationship that exists among the premiers of this country as they look to formulate policies and to advance positions that are beneficial not just to the individual provinces but to the country as a whole. Mr. Chairman, we take positions in order to try and influence not only our collective activities but the activities and policies of the federal government. It is a very important aspect of the work that I do. Our provincial partners in Atlantic Canada will continue to be a focus of our efforts. Our government will continue to make strategic efforts in the regions that hold great benefit for Nova Scotia. I've said this often, Mr. Chairman, that I believe that the potential of the aggregated population of 2.3 million people in the Atlantic region is greater than any single province, and that we need to find more ways to cooperate. We need to find more ways to integrate the business models that we have so that potential investors in looking, whether it's at Halifax or at Moncton or at Charlottetown, will say, this is a region that knows how to work together. We want to do business in the region because, frankly, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I believe that success in the other parts of the region is just as important to Nova Scotia and to Halifax as success in Nova Scotia and Halifax is to the rest of the region. We will seize emerging opportunities in the Caribbean, in the EU, in Vietnam and India. For example, the trade mission to Vietnam last year was a resounding success. We signed a memorandum of understanding with Bà Rà Vũng Tàu province that strengthens our ties with that country's economic engine. Other agreements and agreements forged by the missions involved education and transportation sectors. It also signaled that Nova Scotia is ready and willing to be a competitive force in the world market. To wrap up my comments around trade issues, we will make sure that Nova Scotia's voice is heard in the upcoming trade talks with the European Union. I mentioned the green economy earlier. Government sees many challenges, but also many great opportunities in climate change. Mr. Chairman, just before I leave the European Union talks, I was pleased just a short time ago to meet with the ambassador from France and with the consul general. I want to express to you, and of course through you to the rest of the host, that this was a great opportunity to hear the position being advanced with respect to the trade talks with the European Union and what the diplomats see as some of the exciting opportunities that will exist for the province in trade with France. And I must say I was certainly pleased to receive those entreaties from the French government. Nova Scotia's leadership in the green economy, green technology, climate change, and environmental sustainability will mean a better tomorrow. Government has taken ambitious environmental steps. For example, by 2015, Nova Scotia will get 25% of its electricity production from renewable sources, and hard caps are in place on greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector. Our green businesses have tremendous potential to grow our economy and create highly skilled, well-paying jobs. Government has championed the green economy at such places as the Copenhagen climate change talks, and we will continue to do so. Nova Scotia's LED lighting, carbon capture, and tidal energy technologies are attracting attention from around the globe. Government is taking action because a cleaner, green Nova Scotia benefits us all. I want to talk now, Mr. Chairman, about the number one concern of Nova Scotians: health care. Nova Scotians tell us that improving health care is vitally important. We agree. As I said earlier, our efforts for savings are not geared toward reducing critical services, but improving them. To make those improvements, we need to make some necessary changes to the overall system. For example, a good hard look at our health administration is necessary. My government will redirect some of the funds spent on administration back to frontline care. We need to increase accountability and transparency in our major health capital projects to ensure that we are getting value for our money. A new drug unit will examine ways to reduce the costs of prescription drugs, something that I know is important to this House, is important to the opposition members. They have raised this matter with me on a number of occasions, and I'm sure they're happy to know that we are looking very hard at the way that we can reduce these costs, not just to the province, but also to ordinary consumers. And they will know that there is now this year an opportunity, as many of the brand drugs will be coming off their patents and therefore will be subject to becoming generic drugs, and that this represents the opportunity for considerable savings for the province in prescription drugs. So this is something, Mr. Chairman, that we are pursuing with great vigor, because it means a substantial difference to our costs, but it also means that the flexibility or the ability of government to do other things that it might like to do in this particular area is also enhanced. Mental health and addiction services will be revamped through a new mental health strategy. All are part of my government's efforts to ensure healthcare dollars are being used wisely. The healthcare system needs to be more responsive, more effective, and more efficient. Dr. John Ross delivered an interim report to the government on the province's emergency rooms. It made for interesting reading, and we're eager to see his final report and recommendations. To that end, Mr. Chairman, we have set aside $7.8 million in this budget to improve emergency room services in the province. We will also spend $1.3 million to reduce surgical wait times. Government will also make targeted efforts, such as increasing long-term care beds by some 360, expanding the hours of the Cobequid Health Centre, increasing the availability of radiation therapy in Halifax and Sydney, and adding 5 additional digital mammography machines. Mr. Chairman, before we leave the long-term care sector, Mr. Chairman, as you may know, this is something that I have had a long interest in my time in this House. It is an important aspect of our government's plan. As I said, we're going to expand the number of long-term care beds by some 360, but you will remember that it was through the efforts, not just of myself, but of many people, particularly caregivers across the province, that we were able to convince the previous government, the Ham government, to change the policy with respect to long-term care, and no longer to address, no longer to put those costs or flow them through to the individual. I just would comment on this because, Mr. Chairman, the outpouring from so many people across the province as a result of that change was quite remarkable. The number of letters, the numbers of emails, the number of calls that came into our office as a result of that change was really quite gratifying. I think there were an awful lot of people out there who didn't want to bring attention to this particular policy of government simply because they didn't want to bring attention to their own personal situation. But once the change got made so that you weren't in the position of having to essentially give up everything you'd worked your life for when you went into long-term care, they came forward and said that this was an important initiative, that this was something that they didn't really believe would happen in the end, and that it was a matter of perseverance by so many people that eventually made it happen. Mr. Chairman, my government will also use our healthcare professionals to their full capabilities. Government will put more nurse practitioners into the province's nursing homes to give seniors better support, and pharmacists will soon be able to do injections. Nova Scotia families tell us they want a better healthcare system, but they also want their healthcare dollars to work as hard as possible. My government will be proud to do both. I believe that the budget introduced by the Finance Minister is fair and responsible. It is a plan that makes the right decisions to ensure that this province gets back to balance. As the Economic Advisory Panel said, there are only 3 ways to get back to balance: to reduce spending, increase revenue, and to grow the economy. We have taken their advice and we have done all 3, but not recklessly, not without a plan. We have taken an even-handed approach to changing the unsustainable course of this province and getting back to living within our means. The next few years will offer some difficult challenges for all of us. My government will continue to make the right decisions for Nova Scotia families. And this is really the point, Mr. Chairman. The reality is that we came to government at a very, very difficult time. We came to government finding that the finances of the province were not as they had been presented. We came at a time when the world was experiencing an economic recession like has not been seen in many, many, many years. But we have taken on those challenges. We have said that a responsible government doesn't simply ignore what has happened. It accepts that things are sometimes different than you would have liked them to have been, but you address them through the tools that you have at hand. And we are doing that, Mr. Chairman. We're doing it by responding to the aspirations of Nova Scotians through the Back to the Balance process. We looked at what the available opportunities were for us to get back to balance. Nobody likes to see tax increases, Mr. Chairman. But what we do know is that you have to have enough revenue to be able to support the services that you need to provide. So, Mr. Chairman, we made sure that the vulnerable people in this province were protected from any changes in revenue, and provided them with, in fact, additional income to improve their lives, Mr. Speaker. Those people are better off as a result of this budget, Mr. Chairman. The province is better off as a result of this budget, and will be better off as a result of having a multi-year approach to getting the province back to balance. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to answering the questions of the members opposite. Thank you.
I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to welcome the Premier to budget estimates.
305.
To also welcome his staff, congratulate them on the work they're doing for the people of our province. I know it's in very difficult circumstances that you're asked to be public servants, to fulfill your obligations. So I just want to put on the record Nova Scotians appreciate giving up the time that you give up that no one sees on behalf of all of us. So thank the both of you for that and the work that you're doing. I listened with great interest to the Premier. I had the opportunity to travel the province with the Premier in the last general election. Quite frankly, we've had a very spirited conversation about that since, and I believed then that the Premier was misleading the people of this province. And as I listened to his remarks today, I believe he simply just hasn't caught on to the fact that Nova Scotians have understood that. He's here suggesting that in June 9th, prior to June 9th, there was no way that he could understand what the finances of this province were in. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, I would probably agree with him. I would suggest that that's probably accurate. All the more reason why you shouldn't make a reckless promise of being able to balance the budgets when you don't know the facts. All the more reason why you shouldn't promise you're not going to raise taxes when you don't know the facts. All the more reason why you shouldn't promise you're not going to make cuts when you simply don't know the facts. And what we've seen since that time has been a government that has been trying to find a way to manipulate the views of the people, to find something to hide behind, to run from, and try to get away from every commitment. We're often taught to look at the work that the Deloitte report that had come out had mentioned, and the work that Deloitte was doing. Interestingly enough, if you look at the parameters that was given to Deloitte, it says what would happen if the province of Nova Scotia continued to spend at 6 or 7% with revenue at an all-time low. Mr. Speaker, I don't believe, or Mr. Chair, I don't believe anyone in the general election, even Nova Scotians, believed any government could continue to spend at that rate. So we all knew there was going to have to be changes. So I'm not sure why you would ask Deloitte to continue to give projections at 6 or 7% when you knew you weren't going to be spending at that. And you knew that Nova Scotians didn't expect that. And at revenue at an all-time low. The reason for that, Mr. Chair, is that the government was looking for some cover. The government was looking for a way to justify breaking those commitments to the people of this province. Commitments they knew full well they could not keep. Commitments they knew full well when they campaigned they couldn't keep. And instead of standing in front of the people of Nova Scotia and saying, we misled you, instead of doing that, taking ownership of the mistakes they made, they find cover. They're looking for someone else to hide behind. What's interesting is when they reach for the Deloitte, they talk about the revenue projection of $1.4 billion deficit. They stop short, though, of talking about when Deloitte said, we don't believe you should be prepaying any bills. What do they do in their first budget? They prepay universities to a tune of around $350 million in advance. Money that the people of this province had to borrow, money that the people of this province began to pay on before they had to. All of these things continue to irritate Nova Scotians, quite frankly. I had the opportunity yesterday to be in Truro. I spent part of Friday in Victoria the Lakes. I spent Saturday in Glace Bay, part of Sunday in Richmond County, in Truro, and I spent all day yesterday in the Truro area, meeting with different organizations and talking to them about the future of our province. And what is interesting that I got at just about every meeting, interestingly enough, not the Liberal meetings, but all the other meetings, there was a common theme, and that was, I thought they were going to be new and different. What was new and different? I thought they would tell us like it was. Instead, they've been looking for cover at every direction. It's only 9-10 months. How quickly Nova Scotians have caught on to the deceit that was put before them in that general election. We talk about the work of the economic panel, and I want to thank them for the commitment that the work that they've done on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. It's interesting enough to know that we spent approximately $100,000 to realize that government has two options in front of it: raise taxes, cut services, or grow the economy. Who would have ever thought that? Who would have ever thought that? I wonder what would be the other option? I wonder if there's any other option. And we had to spend $100,000 to get that advice. Why? because we needed some political cover. We needed something to hide behind. We needed something to defend the decisions we were about to make. Because we couldn't blame it on the previous government. That record was getting tired, a bit scratched. You know, oh, it certainly is. When you look more recently and you look at the first budget that was introduced by the NDP government of the province of Nova Scotia, the deficit is $488 million. 350 roughly was a prepayment, 80 million for land. It's getting pretty close to a balanced budget. It's getting pretty close to a balanced budget. Even Deloitte suggested that perhaps the books were balanced when you got them. Your first budget was in deficit, and your second budget's in deficit. And then we go on a road show. With the Minister of Finance. And it's interesting to hear the Premier say it's the most extensive consultation that any government has ever done with the people of this province. Well, he called every group in the province of Nova Scotia that would be asking for money and invited them to the meeting. What school board's not going to ask the government for more money? What hospital board's not going to ask the government for more money? What union leadership is not going to ask the government for more money? I've yet to hear of one. I've yet to hear of one. So to avoid making some tough decisions, we created an environment, very controlled. Minister of Finance gets an opportunity to stand up and address the crowd in his own I know best attitude and say to the people, well, if you don't want that, what if we raise the HST by 15%? By 2% to 15%? Well, I guess the people, if they say, perhaps, but if you say to them, should we buy land or increase your taxes? Why didn't we have that conversation? We should have. Premier and his Minister of Finance talks about, we only moved the HST back to what it used to be. I'm sure the Premier is smart enough to know that at that same time it was 15% in New Brunswick and in the other Atlantic provinces, except for Prince Edward Island. It's deceitful to tell the people of Nova Scotia, in my view, we're just putting it back to where it was, because you've taken it out of the context of before. Premier shaking his head. I can tell you there are many Nova Scotians shaking theirs as they go around and they look and listen. We had a promise of keeping every emergency room open. Dr. Ross is doing his utmost. Dr. Orange, I think he was referred to, doing his utmost to go around the province to reassure communities that government will not be closing their emergency room. I'm looking forward to heading to the Valley tomorrow night. Dr. Ross will be holding a public meeting with the people of the Annapolis Basin area, which will take in the Annapolis Community Health Centre and the Digby Health Facility. We're looking forward to him to reassure those people that not only will the emergency room not be closed, but the hours won't be reduced. That he will keep that commitment of a 24/7 emergency room that was promised during the election campaign. And I'm sure the people of the Basin area will remind him it's not his responsibility to find political cover for this government. It is his responsibility to assess those and find a way and to help work with, in my view, to help work with regional health authorities to find alternative access to health care for those who are entering emergency rooms who shouldn't be there. That's it. Premier and his government and the Minister of Health have already committed to the 24/7 commitment to the people of this province. I listened as the Premier was talking about his budget. There are a few things in it that, quite frankly, we would support. The fact that seniors on guaranteed income supplement won't be paying tax is a positive thing. As we know, when the federal government increased the basic personal exemption and Nova Scotians held theirs, There are many Nova Scotia seniors who were put back on the tax roll. They were put there because the province of Nova Scotia wasn't keeping pace. In fact, when you don't pay federal tax, it means you can't use those receipts that you're holding on to reduce your income tax in the province of Nova Scotia. And we would support that. It's a positive thing. The Premier knows that since I've been in this House, I've talked about the issue of poverty and poverty reduction and how important it is that we, as a province, begin to face up to the amount of children in this province who are living in poverty for all kinds of reasons. There's a social and moral responsibility for us, but also, quite frankly, we will not be able to meet the labour needs going forward if we continue to leave a great number of young Nova Scotians behind and not reaching their full potential. But you know, when you start looking at many of these tax changes, the poverty reduction credit is to a family whose income is less than $12,000. Well, before we rejoice and suggest that it's going to be the savior for those living in poverty in the province of Nova Scotia, well, it may be a good start. It's a far cry from addressing the real challenges facing many low-income Nova Scotians. Well, we talked about the affordable living tax credit for those Nova Scotian families with an income below $30,000. It's a start, and we'll acknowledge that. But really, what's unconscionable is what happens after this, and we start talking about a new tax bracket. We're getting rid of, and we're going to eliminate the surtax. Well, Mr. Chair, I have a problem with this, and the problem is the fact that this government gave me a tax break. This government gave the Premier a tax break. And they gave anyone making over between $83,000 and really $15,000 either a tax break or status quo. And yet a family in my constituency or in any other part of this province making $34,000 has said, too bad, you're on your own. Don't qualify for any help. We appreciate you paying the extra 2% of HST and somehow try to find a way to survive. And yet, we get a tax break. Where's the justice in that? Where's the social justice in that? How does that make sense? How can that be right? And I can tell you, as I look across from here, I know many of your constituencies are no different than mine. You have people coming into your office looking for help to meet the basic needs of living. And some of them have an income of over $34,000 a family. And you're going to say to them, we've done all we can, good luck, thanks very much, we appreciate the extra 2%. You can also say to them, but by the way, front bench got a tax break, and so did the leader of the official opposition. You can even put my name in there to somehow justify it. I don't know how, quite frankly, we can rationalize to Nova Scotians that that's right. How is that right? It isn't. And on top of that, we then start looking at the high income earners in the province and say, we're going to tax even more. A doctor who's we don't have enough of, we're going to say we're going to take taxes from you, but by the way, we're not going to put it in the provincial revenue. We're going to use that money to give us a tax cut. Thank you very much. How does that make sense? Who in their infinite wisdom was sitting around some table rationalizing this piece of public policy? I wonder which cabinet minister said we need a tax break. I know most of them. I'd say not very many of them. But I would have thought, and when someone pointed it out, that they would have said, you know what, that's not right. That's a mistake. And we're going to correct it. But instead, all they did was somehow try to say we were doing some political points with it. I'm not sure that's how Nova Scotians are viewing it, as I've been traveling the province. I listened with interest with the Premier talking about long-term strategy around long-term care. It has been a positive thing for the province of Nova Scotia that we began to cover the costs of long-term care. And I will say in this House, it was something that was led and, by the leader of the Premier now, the leader of the Democratic Party at the time, that it would be that we would pay for the long-term care costs in nursing homes. That's been a positive change for Nova Scotian families. Interestingly enough, I think at the end of the day, all Nova Scotians were in support of that. But it is one way. Long-term care is one way of providing service to seniors in our province, those who are vulnerable, those who need help. Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, we had promoted very heavily a caregiver's allowance, one that was adopted by the previous government, one that was ridiculed by this government last spring in the House, saying it wasn't a program that was that would work for some and wouldn't meet all the needs of those who needed it. And yet, when we've asked for the new program, there isn't one. We're continuing to work with the old one to roll out a caregiver's allowance program. Mr. Premier, I would suggest to you that the time is moving on very quickly, and there are many Nova Scotians who need your government to respond in a positive way to help support those caregivers who are looking after a loved one at home and needing your support. With much fanfare, many Nova Scotians believed that we in this House were going to keep that commitment and that program would be available to Nova Scotians. We'd supported the original program. Your government in the spring was very critical of it. When your first budget came out, there were lots of questions in this House around that, and many times your government stood up and said we were going to have our own program and we were going to introduce it. Well, we're waiting, and Nova Scotians are waiting for that. I would encourage you to move towards making sure that happens sooner rather than later. This is an exciting year. I know the Premier mentioned a number of times about some anniversaries, some exciting firsts. I'm looking forward to the Queen coming as well. I'm also looking forward to the 400th celebration of Member Two's baptism, which will be taking place in the riding of Annapolis. I think there'll be an announcement coming up tomorrow. That is a positive recognition of the First Nations community in the beginning of our relationship. Their beginning in belief and faith in Christianity and their connection with mainstream religion here in the Catholic Church in the province of Nova Scotia. And I'm looking forward to that. I also want to, before I begin to ask some budget questions, I want to also acknowledge the work that was done by the government and will continue to be done around the issue of Africville. For too long, this issue has been one that has been very divisive, one that has been, it's been wrong. There's no other way to put it. It has been scarring to families. It's divided families, quite frankly, all because of, in my view, short-sightedness, a level of prejudice on behalf of the people of that time. And it is one that I want to congratulate the Premier on for allowing us to begin the healing process that is around this issue and champion. And I want to thank and congratulate the people of the former community of Africville for their perseverance. This has been a long struggle for them, and it is one that I think they deserve very much. With that, I would like to begin to start asking a few questions around estimates, Mr. Premier. And I noticed and I listened quite attentively the amount of travel that has taken place. I asked you earlier today some questions around expenses of people in your office. So I will, in the spirit of continuing on with that, I will ask, and you mentioned about the Eastern State Governors, and I know on Friday there was some talk here about a taxi receipt, which I explained, but I want to give you an opportunity. I want to talk about that particular trip that you took to Burlington. I assume and I believe that perhaps that your family was with you when you. But yeah, which is a positive thing, and I think all Nova Scotians would be grateful to hear that. That she was on vacation. Your family, like many families in this house, give up a tremendous amount of time so that you can fulfill your duties to the people of the province, and it's nice to see that she gets the opportunity to travel with you some. On that same trip, though, you traveled. I think you drove from here to Vermont. Then you went, which is approximately 716 kilometers. It's 1432 roughly, if I do my math is good. I'm not. There was a claim for 2,374 kilometers. There was also in that same claim a taxi chit that you drove from Vermont, or I guess you took a taxi from Vermont to Montreal to catch your flight to that meeting, and then to Saskatchewan, and then you flew back from Saskatchewan to Nova Scotia. So I'm assuming that those expenses include your trip home, or perhaps you could explain the discrepancy in the mileage then if it's not on the trip home.
Thank you. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you. Well, the only claim that would have been made would have been for the mileage on the way there. I'm pleased to ask my staff to have a look at that, but the only claim that would have been made would have been, of course, for the cost of the travel from Nova Scotia to Vermont. Pardon me, from Vermont to Montreal, because we were going on to the Council of Federation. We looked at every option that was available to be able to make that travel. There was no bus that was available. I even had a look at the train schedule to see whether or not, because there is a train that goes through there, but there were none that you could get that would go in the appropriate time in order to get to Montreal. We could have flown, but which was actually the most convenient thing to do, but it would have cost more than to have a taxi. It was, I think, somewhere in the vicinity of $600 or $700. It probably wouldn't have attracted attention like a taxi does, but it does actually cost more if you proceed in that fashion. The trip to so we use that in order to get to Montreal in time in order to get the flight on to Regina. Unfortunately, when we got to Montreal, the flight to Regina was grounded because there had been a lightning strike at the airport. No, that's not quite right. I think we flew from Montreal to Toronto, that's right. Landed in Toronto, there had been a lightning strike, so we sat on the tarmac, I think, for a little over 2.5 hours. We were eventually offloaded in Toronto, but all the flights out of Toronto to Regina were either canceled or delayed, so I ended up in the airport in Toronto I think until something like 2 o'clock in the morning that morning. I wasn't alone. I was there with the Premier of Prince Edward Island and the Premier of New Brunswick, both who found them in the same selves in the same situation. A little while later, we were joined by Premier McGuinty from Ontario. So the four of us sat in the airport, I think, until about 2 o'clock in the morning or so, and then eventually Air Canada put a flight back on, which we were lucky enough to get on because we had to then sign up standby in order to get onto that flight. I think we arrived, and it's been a while now, so don't hold me to these actual time frames. I think we arrived at the airport at something around 4 o'clock in the morning, Saskatchewan time, is my recollection. We did manage to get to the hotel. Unfortunately, as you'll also note in some of that, although we made it there, our luggage did not make it there. So I had, for the Council of Federation meeting the next day, a pair of jeans, a pair of sneakers, and the shirt I was wearing. So that, of course, made it very, very difficult to take part in the next day's proceedings. Outside of this house, the member for Argyle raised questions about the purchase of certain items while I was in Regina, and I want to assure him that, and to assure yourself that the next day at I think it was 10 to 10, I found myself standing outside the doors of the bay in Regina. I won't speak too much for my colleague, but along with one of the other premiers, and looking for the reasonable attire to be able to attend the next day's function, not knowing if we were going to be there for 1 day or for 2 days. And I think in the course of that, I purchased a couple of pairs of pants, a couple of shirts, those sorts of things, and then went to Moore's, where I know I'm taking you on an excursion through my shopping trip, but to Moore's, where I bought a suit coat. Because this, I know. This is the, yeah. Well, I just want them to know. Yeah, well, but it's about an expense, and what happened was initially those expenses got submitted. As soon as I realized they'd been submitted, we withdrew them, sent the expenses to Air Canada, since it was their fault that the baggage didn't arrive, and unfortunately for me, those have never been paid. But we continue to pursue them with the airline. I'll let you get on to the rest of your questions.
Thank you. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that travel log of your trip, Premier. But what the question I asked you was the travel from here to Vermont, which as you just said, you went one direction and then you took a taxi to Montreal, then you flew to Saskatchewan. What I'm wondering about is why the taxpayers of the province of Nova Scotia will build 2,374 kilometers for a round trip from Halifax to Vermont.
The Honourable, the Premier.
Not show that, so perhaps you could just send it over to me. I'd be happy to have a look at it.
Thank you. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will do that, Premier. The next question that I have is the issue around the IBEW conference you did in Prince Edward Island. I know that when you went there, I'm assuming you gave a speech. Did you? I know that as I look on the website, that your staff have laid out the speech you gave in a couple of speeches you gave in Toronto. I was wondering if they'd be so kind, and you'd be so kind to table the speech that you gave in Prince Edward Island, so that we get an opportunity to see that. The IBEW also said it's standard practice that they invite premiers to their conferences. I would ask you, were you joined by the Premier of Prince Edward Island as well as the Premier of New Brunswick? And they covered, or there was no claim, I guess, for accommodations, but you had billed for a flight over there. Did you not stay? Did you not stay overnight, or did you just left here, flew there, and flew back? Perhaps you would give us some indication around that trip.
The Honourable Premier.
Sure. I'm happy to have my staff find the speech that I gave, and would be pleased to table that, or either table it or to forward it to you as you desire. We did stay overnight. It may be that those costs were covered by the conference. Again, I can have that responded to for you. Of course, the flight is the flight cost of getting to the conference and back. I think their tradition is to invite one of the premiers each year, but I'm not sure, and you'd have to talk to them about that. I know that that I did get a message from Premier Giz that he was not able to make it, but just sending me along his best wishes for a good conference and time and good experience in his province, and that's the only contact that I would have had. When I go to one of the other premiers' province, even if I'm only there even if I'm on personal business, I travel frequently, for example, to New Brunswick because my sister lives in Lincoln, outside of Fredericton. I make it a habit always to tell the premier whose province I'm going into that I'm going to be there, so that they're not surprised if they hear reports of me in downtown Fredericton for some reason. But it's a courtesy that you tell the other premiers that you're going to be there.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
That's a great practice that you notify, and I hope that you fill your tank up in Nova Scotia before you go into New Brunswick and buy anything that you may need in the province of Nova Scotia. We wouldn't want that to become part of question period as we go forward. I had forward to, well, some might, Mr. Premier, but I wouldn't. I look forward to reading that speech. I look forward to seeing it, the one that you would have given to your brothers and sisters in arms in Prince Edward Island. So I'm sure it'll be inspiring. You also gave a speech at the Empire Club, I believe, in Toronto. You were joined there by, I believe, just 2 staff members. I believe your chief of staff and maybe your director of communications was with you on that trip. There's a breakfast for 3. I'm curious who had breakfast. Was it 3 of you, or did you have breakfast with some others that was for $106.53?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't recall who I would have had breakfast with that morning. I know that there were, of course, many people in the there. We didn't just go for the speech at the Empire Club. We had other itinerary while we were there. We took the opportunity to fill as much of my calendar as I could. I was pleased at that time also to be hosted by Frank McKenna for the purposes of meeting many of the business people in Toronto who do business with Nova Scotia. I also met with other individuals who may not have been covered off in that, but who were looking to do business in the province. So. It may have been, and I don't recall. I can try and find that answer for you, but it may have been that was a breakfast meeting with some other people.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I look forward to the answer, Premier, because at that same trip, there was you and one of your staff also claimed a per diem. As you know, that is inappropriate. So I look forward to seeing if you could find out who you had breakfast with and whether or not that was whether or not the taxpayers in Nova Scotia were had also paid for a per diem for you at the same time. I'm curious if you had a followed trip, the one actually to Copenhagen. I believe you had one staff member with you. I'm curious why it was important to take your Director of Communications and Chief of Staff to Toronto to the tune of roughly $3,000 to do that meeting.
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's important. It was an opportunity for me as the Premier of the province, essentially in the opening days of my government, to introduce myself to the Toronto investment community. I was there to give an important speech to the Empire Club. There were many meetings that were taking place at that time, and we thought it was best to use the time that I had to coordinate as many of those meetings as I could. So in some of those meetings, my Chief of Staff would be with me because he would be the appropriate person for that particular meeting. In other meetings, my Director of Communications may be there for one reason or another, or he was there to specifically oversee the setup and the arrangements for the speech to the Empire Club, and to ensure that there was an appropriate communications plan for what we were doing while we were there. We felt this was a great opportunity for us to speak directly to a community that does a lot of business in the province of Nova Scotia, and we wanted to make sure that that was done as effectively and efficiently as is possible.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you for that, Premier. I recognize that it's important for the Premier of our province to go. The question was around the number of staff, and I appreciate your remarks to that. And I would encourage you to continue to seek the advice of Frank McKenna as you go forward to try to govern our province, but also seek investment outside of our province. It is one of the ways that I believe we can grow the economy. You and I have had a number of discussions about renewable energies, and I'm sure we'll have a few more as this debate continues on about that. But I do think it's important, and we're just looking for some clarification on some of these details. So I look forward to the response. You also did another speech in Toronto. I think it's with the Killam analysts, is it? And institutional investors. There were actually 16, 17. There were actually two receipts for this trip. There was one that was billed to the Premier's office, as we see for the total was, the airfare, hotel room, and a per diem was $888.31. There was also one billed. The same bill was billed to Intergovernmental Affairs for the same amount, for a grand total of $1757.08. Why would that be divided? Why would it have been split between the Premier's office and Intergovernmental Affairs?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you. I don't know the answer to that question. I've just asked my staff about it. It may be that Intergovernmental Affairs were supporting a staff person who went with me on that trip. So part of that would have been billed to Intergovernmental Affairs. The other part of it would have been billed to my office for my travel.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
We happened to see that particular one. I'm just curious about the trip that you did with the Empire Club. the trip that you had to Prince Edward Island to speak to the IBEW. Whether or not there were staff that went with you that were billed to other departments, whether or not there are other costs associated with that trip that perhaps don't show up in the Premier's office?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, we've given you all of the expenses as they pertain to this. If they were billed in intergovernmental affairs, they would show up in intergovernmental affairs, but they wouldn't have been billed elsewhere. Yeah, no.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. I guess what I'm asking you is but I guess that's the trip that you went to Toronto and spoke, that you divided your travel up between two departments. What I'm asking you is, I spoke to you about your trip to that you took to the Empire Club, and we had identified that there was your chief of staff was with you, your director of communications, who were received to your department. Was there any other staff that would have been received to another department?
Thank you. The Honourable Premier.
Be the same, yes. Yeah.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thanks very much for that. I want to acknowledge taking in staff is not something that we're frowning upon. I'm just looking for some clarification on that, as well as your. I was pretty critical of our trip to Copenhagen, quite frankly. I felt as a province, and I was critical here. I felt it was important that we as a country were represented by our national government, who was there, who were talking about what we would do as a country when it comes to the issue of carbon and how we were going to deal with it. I felt our time would be better, your time and the government's time would be better spent here dealing with the issue that's in front of us. In fact, that we burn so much fossil fuel to generate energy in this province, and how we're going to build an energy corridor to deal with the issue of putting renewable energies online and making sure that we have access to them. We can harness all the renewable energy we like. If we don't have the capacity to move it around our province or in and out of our province, it will be for naught, and won't solve our issues of getting ourselves off the fossil fuels, as you talked about today in question period. But I noticed on that trip, it wasn't, you didn't have your director of communications with you, you didn't have your chief of staff, you had your political arm with you from your office in Matheb. I'm wondering why you would be taking the political view from your department and not your director of communications, or quite frankly your chief of staff.
Thank you. The Honourable Premier.
Actually, I think you're confused about that. The person who traveled to Copenhagen with me was my chief of staff, was Mr. O'Connor. The Copenhagen trip was an important one for this province. I certainly wasn't alone there. The Premier of Manitoba was there, Mr. Selinger, as was the Premier of Quebec. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that and what most people may not realize, is that the Copenhagen Conference, although it was an international gathering of states who look at the protocol in this regard and are looking to come to an international agreement. The reality is that there are also two other things that take place at the same, and that is that there is a meeting of all of the subnationals throughout the world, and so these are states, provinces, other jurisdictions that, although not national in scope, are the ones who actually end up with the task or the burden of implementing whatever agreement ends up being taken. So, for example, many of the states in the United States, and most notably Mr. Schwarzenegger from California, was there as well, because they're the ones, we are the ones, frankly, the provinces, who are the ones who actually end up implementing the protocol. We're the ones who end up with the responsibility to ensure that the targets are ultimately going to be met. And this comes back, as you're quite right, it comes back to something I talked about a little bit earlier in question period. The protocol is important because ultimately the province of Nova Scotia will end up having to deal with the fallout of the decisions that are going to be made in other jurisdictions, and in our case, at a time when the federal government, and this is not my opinion, but this is what was happening at the Copenhagen conference, at a time when they were having a very difficult time. Each day they were being, I guess castigated is the best word to use, or criticized, and winning at that point what was called the Fossil of the Day Awards. The province of Nova Scotia and some of the other provinces who were there were actually winning awards from an alliance of environmental groups who were there to represent the pan-Canadian environmental movement. And so I was very pleased to be in the position to be able to actually accept an award on behalf of the province for the hard caps that we put in place on greenhouse gas emissions. The Minister of Environment was there, and he was able to receive an award as well from that same group. So the story that emerged out of Copenhagen was that although people were not necessarily enamored with the work that was being done by the federal government in relation to the protocol, they were very happy with a lot of the work that was being done by the provinces, who ultimately are actually responsible for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and additional things. Now, the other thing that many people don't necessarily realize about what was going on in Copenhagen is that Copenhagen was also, I think to that point, the largest single marketplace for new green technology through the Green Expo that was taking place at the same time, or concurrent with the Copenhagen conference. We had an opportunity. We were traveling there with business people from Nova Scotia, and I of course, it's difficult because I can't give up information with respect to the individual businesses and their agenda. But I can tell you this: we had an opportunity with some of the people who were there, some of the business people who were there, on their behalf and with them, to meet with some of the largest institutional investors in Europe. These are people who are interested in looking at the technology that is being developed in this province for the purposes of renewable energy, who are willing to make investments in that technology. So not just to create renewable energy here, but for the purposes of being able to take that technology and allow it to be exported to the world. So the purpose for being there was not a unipurpose. It was not a unipurpose visit. It was a visit that was aimed at doing a number of different things, and we apply this model to each one of the trips that we did, as we discussed with the trip to Toronto. We attempt to do as much business as we can put into a trip as possible in the time that we are there. Mainly for reasons of efficiency. But of course, if we can get that done, then it cuts down on the number of trips that you have to make or the amount of time that you have to spend. So we actually spend a fair amount of time mapping out the itineraries while we're in places to allow us to be as efficient as possible on behalf of the people of the province. And this is, I mean, I expect that this is probably what past governments did as well. I mean, I don't know, and I think until you're in that position, it's difficult to realize just what kind of support you also need to be able to do that. And I see you have another question.
No, I appreciate that.
Thank you. The Honourable the Leader of the Official
Opposition. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't jump ahead. When I was going through your expenses, I felt like I was in a viewing of Up in the Air. So I do apologize for getting your trips mixed up. And you're correct. It was your Chief of Staff that was with you in Copenhagen. It was your political arm that was with you in Vietnam. But I will save that conversation about that trip at a later date. I do want to talk about this trip to Copenhagen, and I appreciate the fact that business people were with you, being exposed to green technology, an opportunity to expand their business. I think that's probably a legitimate conversation to have about whether or not it's a decent trip. But to suggest that the province of Nova Scotia is going to determine the stance by our federal government, and regardless of how many premiers were there, Premier, I think the people of this province would have been better served to have you in this province and your government in this province dealing with the real issues that's facing us. The fact of the matter is our energy, we have a real challenge here, and the fact that most of our energy is produced by the burning of coal and fossil fuels. And the Daewoo project that your government hangs on to as its success story, which is $60 million of Nova Scotian money in it, $10 million of federal money in it, and it's a $70 million public investment into a $90 million deal. Doesn't send 1 kilowatt of energy to the people of Nova Scotia. Doesn't improve our footprint. The only thing that we know for certain is that if the company loses money, we're on the hook for 49%. Even the company suggests if they make money, probably no profit for anyone because they're going to pour it back into the company. So we put $70 million of public money into this great green energy deal, and the total cost is $90 million, and there's not 1 kilowatt of energy to the people of the province of Nova Scotia. How's that improving the footprint? What happened in Copenhagen to create that kind of a climate change? You know, I watched with interest as the deal in New Brunswick was going on and, with the Hydro-Quebec. And as you know, I've been encouraging the previous government, and I've encouraged you about creating a conversation with our Atlantic premiers about an energy corridor to build a connection between our provinces to make sure that the renewable energy that we have access to. We're very fortunate as a region, Lower Churchill, the Bay of Fundy, the great wind potential that is here, that we as a region have an opportunity to take advantage of that to create stable energy pricing. Every business will tell you one of their concerns going forward is energy pricing. The opportunity there is, though, to create stable energy environment around renewables and creating that energy corridor which would connect us to Newfoundland and Labrador, connect us to New Brunswick as well as Prince Edward Island, and also give us access to the eastern seaboard. So any excess energy that we may have, we could ship into the United States to bring that revenue back in to the province to reinvest. As it stands now, there's a huge possibility that we do not do something around the corridor and being able to move that energy. Bay of Fundy will end up in New Brunswick because their system is there. Premier, you can shake your head. It's the reality. We've stood by and